All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're taking a look at week7.pdf. It's a GradeGuru summary all about confidence intervals,
Uh-huh.
specifically for proportions.
Yeah, confidence intervals for proportions. These are,
It sounds kind of complicated,
yeah, it does.
but we're going to break it down.
Yeah,
And hopefully by the end of this, you're going to be like, oh, that's not so bad.
exactly. And you know what? It's especially relevant, I think, for first-year students, right?
Yeah.
Because they're always doing all these surveys and polls and stuff on campus.
Totally.
And this is how they figure out what all that data actually means.
Yeah, you're going to be able to, ace your next stats quiz, but also understand those,
Exactly.
9 out of 10 dentists recommend and all
Like
those
stats you see online.
sort of things, yeah.
Yeah, be a little more critical of all that.
For sure. Okay, so let's imagine that we're trying to figure out the average height of everyone in your massive first-year lecture hall,
Okay.
but measuring everyone would just take forever.
Yeah, way too long.
So instead of doing that, you take a smaller group of people, let's say 50,
Okay.
and you find their average height.
Yep.
Now that gives you a decent guess.
Sure.
But how confident are you that that actually reflects the true average height of everyone in that entire lecture hall?
That's where confidence intervals come in, right?
Yes,
It gives us like a range
Yeah.
based on that small group and where the real average probably falls.
So it's kind of like saying we're 95% confident that the average height of everyone in this lecture hall is somewhere between 5'8" and 5'10".
Exactly.
It's a range.
Yeah.
Not just one number.
Yeah, and it makes sense because we're working with a smaller piece of the entire
Right,
math.
exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the GradeGuru summary, it mentions two types of confidence intervals.
Yes.
One for a single proportion and one for comparing two.
Yeah, so what's the difference between those?
So the difference really depends on what we're looking at.
Okay.
If we're looking at just one group, like, say, everyone in your lecture hall, that's a single proportion.
Okay.
But if you're comparing, say, the average heights of first years in two different lecture halls,
Oh,
then you're comparing two proportions.
gotcha.
Let's look at an example, because the summary talks about figuring out how many students use public transportation regularly.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of a single proportion confidence interval.
Okay, so let's say you survey 500 students,
Okay.
and you find out that 120 of them are regularly using public transportation.
Okay.
That's a sample proportion of 24%.
24%.
Okay, now, to get the confidence interval,
Yes.
we need to know a few things.
Okay.
We need to know the sample proportion, which we have, 24%.
Okay.
We need to know the sample size, which is 500.
Yep.
And then there's this thing called a critical value.
A critical value.
And it's connected to how confident we want to be in the results.
Uh-huh.
Let's say for this, we want to be 95% confident.
95%. Okay.
The critical value for that is 1.960.
Okay, wait a minute. Where does that 1.960 come from?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It comes from something called the standard normal distribution.
Uh-huh.
It's basically, that bell curve you've probably seen.
Right, yeah.
Basically, this number helps us make our range a little bit wider
Okay.
so that we can be 95% sure
Gotcha.
that it contains the true proportion.
So we're not just guessing.
Exactly.
We're adding in a little bit of a buffer.
Exactly, a little bit of a safety net.
Okay, so we're plugging all this into a formula.
Exactly. And luckily, computers can do this for us now.
Thankfully. Yeah.
We get a confidence interval of 20.26% to 27.74%.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm following, we're 95% confident that the true proportion of all students who use public transit falls somewhere between 20.26% and 27.74%.
Yes, we can't be 100% certain without asking every single student.
Right.
But based on our sample, it gives us a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Now, we can't forget about the assumptions
The assumptions, yes.
that the summary talks about.
Uh-huh.
The sample size has to be big enough for this to work, but in this example, we're all good.
Yeah, the numbers check out.
Okay, so far so good.
All right, so what about comparing proportions between those two groups?
Okay, so let's look at example exercise 2.
Okay.
And imagine we want to find out if that new study method that everyone's talking about actually helps students get better grades.
Okay, yeah.
We've got two groups, Group A, who's trying the new method, and Group B, who are just sticking to the old ways.
Sounds like a classic experiment.
Classic experiment, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the summary says 150 out of 300 students in Group A, so that's 50%, improve their grades.
Okay.
In Group B, 160 out of 400, that's 40%, improve their grades.
So we've got a difference there.
Yeah, so there's a 10% difference.
10% difference.
But is that difference actually because of the new method, or is it just random chance?
Ooh, good question.
That's where a confidence interval for the difference between those proportions comes in.
Okay, so we're not just looking at the 50% and the 40%. We're looking at the gap between them.
Yes, we're looking at the gap, and we're basically saying, is this gap big enough to actually be meaningful?
Oh, okay.
And to answer that question, we need to calculate a confidence interval for that difference.
Right.
This time we're going to go with a 99% confidence interval just to be extra sure.
Even more certain. Okay.
So after we do the calculations, we get a range of 0.26% to 19.74%.
Okay.
Now this is important. This interval does not include 0.
Oh, why is that important?
Imagine a seesaw, right?
Okay.
If the seesaw is perfectly balanced, that's like a difference of 0.
Right.
Neither side is really winning.
Okay.
But if one side is like clearly higher, then we know there's a real difference.
Oh.
So our confidence interval is like a statistical seesaw.
A statistical seesaw.
It tells us whether or not that 10-point difference is actually real, or if it's just a fluke.
Gotcha.
And in this case, it looks like that new study method might actually be doing something.
It might be onto something. It's exactly.
This is really cool.
I know, right?
I'm starting to see how these confidence intervals can actually help us make sense of all these stats that we see.
All the time, yeah.
All the time.
And we've really only just scratched the surface.
I know, right?
There's so much more to uncover.
There's so much more.
So let's take a deeper dive.
Let's do it.
We've talked about, like, how to calculate these things, but I feel like we should take a step back for a second.
Okay.
And just, like, think about what it all means.
I like where you're going with this.
Because it's easy to get lost in the numbers.
Right.
And forget why we're even doing this in the first place.
Exactly. And that's the thing with statistics.
Yeah.
And especially confidence intervals. They're actually really powerful tools.
They are. And think about all the information that we see every single day.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's like news articles, social media, research studies. They're all just full of statistics.
Full of them.
But how do we know which ones to trust?
Like, how can we tell if someone's, like, backing up a claim with actual evidence? Or are they just trying to, like, make a point?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
And I feel like understanding confidence intervals can help us do that.
Absolutely.
They give us a way to, like, evaluate those claims.
Yeah.
Ask the right questions.
Totally.
And, like, make smarter decisions.
It's not just about passing a stats class.
Probably.
It's about being, like, a more informed person in general.
Absolutely. So let's say, for example, you see some headline.
Okay.
That's like, new study shows drinking coffee boosts productivity by 20%.
Yeah, you see that all the time.
All the time, right. And now you're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
What was their sample size?
Right.
Did they even calculate a confidence interval?
Exactly.
And if they did, like, does that confidence interval actually back up that 20% claim?
Exactly.
So we can kind of use this as a way to spot those red flags or see if something is as impressive as it sounds.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for statistics.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's so true.
It is. It's like you can decode all the stuff that's being thrown at you.
It's making me think about all sorts of things, like from political polls to research studies, like you read about in, like, health class.
It's everywhere.
Confidence intervals are everywhere.
They are.
And once you know how to interpret them, it's really eye-opening.
Yeah, it can change the whole game.
Okay, so let's take those political polls as an example. You often see those.
Yeah.
Where it's like, candidate A is ahead by whatever percentage.
Right. And they always have that, like, margin of error.
Margin of error, yeah.
Is that plus or minus?
Yes.
And that is based on confidence intervals.
That's exactly what it is.
It is, yeah.
It's telling you that range of where the true level of support for that candidate probably falls.
Right. So you could see, like, candidate A is leading candidate B by 5%.
Right.
But the margin of error is plus or minus 3%.
Right.
Meaning the actual lead could be anywhere from 2% to 8%, which is like, is it a close race or is it a landslide?
Yeah.
You don't know.
We don't know.
Confidence intervals help us with that.
Yeah. They keep us from jumping to conclusions.
Right. Exactly.
This reminds me of that saying, there are 3 types of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
Right. But I think understanding confidence intervals actually helps us combat that.
It does.
It helps us to be more critical of the statistics we see.
Yeah.
Demand more transparency.
Absolutely.
And see past, like, the spin.
So statistics can be used to mislead, but they can also be used to empower.
Completely agree.
It all comes down to, like you said, knowing how to interpret them.
Yes, exactly.
It's so important for everyone to understand this stuff.
Not just statisticians.
Not just statisticians, no, because we're bombarded with this stuff all the time.
It's about being informed, thinking critically,
Yeah.
and just navigating this world that's just like overloaded with information.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
I feel like this has been such an insightful deep dive.
It has.
It's so cool how a concept that seems so simple, like confidence intervals, can actually completely change the way we see the world around us.
It can, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because
Yeah.
we've been talking a lot about what confidence intervals are
Yeah.
and how to calculate them.
Mm-hmm.
But are there ever times when they might not be the best tool for the job?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Like, any tool has its limitations.
Right.
And if the underlying assumptions aren't met, then the results that you get can actually be really misleading.
Yeah, and if you think about it, we talked about how the sample size needs to be big enough.
Right.
If it's too small.
Yeah.
The confidence interval might be so wide
It's useless.
that it's essentially useless.
Exactly.
So it's a one-size-fits-all solution.
Not at all.
No, it's important to consider the context, the data,
Yeah.
and the assumptions behind the methods that you're using.
And sometimes other statistical tools might be more appropriate or give you additional insights.
So it's just about being thoughtful and critical, not just blindly accepting every statistic that you see.
I love that. Yeah, it's about using these tools wisely.
Yes.
And recognizing both their power and their limitations.
Yes. Beautifully said.
Thank you.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
I've enjoyed it too. I always love demystifying statistics and showing how it connects to the real world.
Yeah, me too.
And I have a feeling people are going to start seeing confidence intervals everywhere now.
They are. They're going to be like, oh, there's one.
Exactly. And hopefully they have the tools and the confidence to actually interpret those numbers with a critical eye.
Exactly. And, it's funny because we started by talking about how statistics can seem dry and complicated.
Yeah.
But I think we've shown that it can actually be engaging and even exciting.
It can be.
If you approach it the right way. I completely agree. It's all about asking interesting questions.
Yes.
Exploring patterns and just uncovering the truth.
And who knows, maybe we've even inspired some future statisticians out there.
That would be amazing.
It would. But even if our listeners don't go on to become, professional number crunchers, I hope they come away from this with a new appreciation for the power of statistics.
Yes.
And critical thinking.
Yeah. Okay, well said.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think it's time to wrap up our statistical adventure for today.
I think so.
But before we do, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, I like this.
We've talked about how to calculate confidence intervals and how to use them to evaluate claims. But I want you all to think about this. How might understanding confidence intervals change the way you consume information and make decisions in your own lives?
That's a good one.
It's a really interesting question to think about as you, navigate this complex world that we live in.
Right. It is. That's a great thought to leave everyone with.
Yeah, a huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this deep dive into confidence intervals.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive adventure.
See ya.
I was thinking back to those examples from the GradeGuru summary.
Yeah.
We talked about how certain assumptions have to be met for those calculations to work.
Right, like a large enough sample size.
Exactly. And it's easy to kind of just overlook those assumptions.
Yeah.
But they're actually really important.
They are. They're like the foundation of a house, right?
Yeah.
If the foundation is shaky, the whole thing can come crumbling down.
Exactly. So what happens if those assumptions aren't met?
Right.
Like, what if our sample size is too small?
Yeah.
Or the data just doesn't fit the mold?
That's when we have to think about using other statistical tools, right? There's a whole bunch of tools in the statistics toolbox.
It's true.
And confidence intervals are just one of them.
It makes me realize that statistics is a lot more complex than I originally thought.
It is, yeah.
It's not just about plugging numbers into a formula.
Right.
It's about understanding the concepts and knowing which methods to use.
Yes, exactly. It's like being a chef.
Okay.
You wouldn't use the same recipe for a cake and a soup, right?
That's true.
So in statistics, we need to choose the right tools and techniques depending on what we're working with.
So for someone who's maybe feeling lost in the world of statistics, what advice would you give them?
I would say first, Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
Statistics can seem intimidating, but it really starts to make sense the more you learn about it. Second, focus on understanding the why behind those formulas.
Oh, that's so important.
It's not just about memorizing equations, it's about understanding the logic.
Yes.
And third, practice, practice, practice. The more you work with real examples, the more comfortable you'll become.
That's great advice. And speaking of practice, our GradeGuru summary came with a bunch of practice problems.
Yeah, it did.
I'm feeling inspired to go try a few out now.
You should. There's no better way to really solidify your understanding than by actually using it.
Putting those concepts into action.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of confidence intervals.
We have.
I hope you found it as enlightening as I have.
It's been a pleasure exploring these concepts with you.
Likewise, and just remember, statistics isn't just about numbers. It's about understanding the world around us.
Absolutely.
Making informed decisions.
Yes.
And just being more confident in navigating all the information out there.
Beautifully said.
So next time you see a statistic, don't just skim over it. Take a moment to think about it. Think about the confidence interval, the margin of error, the assumptions behind it.
Yes.
And armed with this knowledge, you'll be well equipped to separate fact from fiction and be a more informed person.
And who knows, you might even find yourself enjoying statistics a little bit.
Maybe. All right, until next time, stay curious. Keep those brains buzzing.
See you later.